And the weight of the rope. The rope stretched tight across the cliff edge of Hacksaw Ridge, its hemp fibers dark with morning rain, and something else that Private First Class Jimmy Crawford didn't want to think about too hard. 40 feet below, the collection point buzzed with medics and stretcher bearers, their voices barely audible over the distant crack of rifle fire that had been echoing across Okinawa's coral ridges since before dawn. Crawford tested the rope's anchor point one more time, wrapping it around the splintered remains of what had once been a substantial tree, now reduced to a jagged stump by 3 days of artillery exchanges. "This thing's gonna hold, right?" Crawford asked, more to himself than to anyone in particular. Desmond Doss knelt beside his medical kit, methodically checking supplies that had already been checked twice in the past hour. His hands moved with practiced efficiency through rolls of bandages, morphine syringes, and the few remaining tourniquets. But Crawford noticed the way those same hands trembled slightly when they thought no one was watching. The 77th Infantry Division had been clinging to the top of this ridge for 72 hours now, and every man up here knew that staying meant accepting casualties they couldn't easily evacuate. "It'll hold," Doss said quietly, his voice carrying that strange calm that had begun to unnerve some of the men. "The rope's not the part I'm worried about." Lieutenant Morrison emerged from the communication post, his face grim with the kind of news that company commanders delivered in clipped, careful sentences. The platoon gathered in the relative shelter of a shell crater, 40-odd men who had climbed this ridge as part of a larger assault and now found themselves isolated on a plateau that felt more like a target than a position. "Division wants us to hold until tomorrow morning," Morrison announced. "Relief columns been delayed by resistance in the valley. Japanese have us zeroed in from 3 directions, and they know exactly where our supply lines run." Crawford caught the glance that passed between Morrison and Doss, a wordless exchange that spoke to conversations already held out of earshot. The wounded had been accumulating since yesterday afternoon, men too hurt to fight, but not critical enough to risk the dangerous descent down Hacksaw Ridge's sheer southern face. The rope represented their only reliable evacuation route, and everyone understood that using it meant exposing both patient and medic to enemy observation from the caves that honeycombed the ridge's upper slopes. Sergeant Phillips, his left arm still bandaged from yesterday's action, pointed toward the eastern approaches, where movement had been detected just after sunrise. "They're massing for something," he said. "Could be probing attacks, could be the real thing. Either way, we're gonna have more wounded before this is over." Doss stood slowly, shouldering his aid kit with movements that had become automatic over months of combat across the Pacific. He carried no weapon, a fact that had initially caused friction within the unit, but now simply marked him as different, the medic who moved forward when others took cover, who stayed exposed when tactical doctrine demanded concealment. His refusal to bear arms had seemed like a luxury back in training, but here on the ridge it had evolved into something harder to define or dismiss. "How many can we get down before dark?" Doss asked, nodding toward the rope. "Maybe 6 if we're careful," Morrison replied. "Maybe 8 if we're lucky and the Japs don't start dropping mortars on the cliff face." Private Williams, barely 20 and still adjusting to the weight of combat equipment, stared at the rope with obvious reluctance. He'd been the one to help rig the evacuation system, tying knots that would have to support wounded men being lowered through space with nothing but coral rocks and Japanese positions below. The rope itself was standard military issue, hemp fiber designed for hauling supplies rather than human cargo, but it was what they had, and what they had would have to be enough. The rain that had been falling intermittently since dawn began again, a light drizzle that made the rope slippery and reduced visibility across the plateau. Crawford watched Doss check the anchor point one final time, running his hands along the rope where it wrapped around the tree stump, testing for frayed spots that might fail under stress. There was something methodical about the medic's preparation, attention to detail that went beyond standard procedure into the realm of personal responsibility. From somewhere in the distance came the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery, followed by the crump of explosions that walked across the ridge's northern approaches. The Japanese were adjusting their fires, feeling for American positions, with the kind of patience that suggested they had plenty of ammunition and all the time in the world. Morrison's radio crackled with reports from observation posts, fragments of tactical information that painted a picture of an enemy willing to wait for the right moment to strike. "They know about the rope," Crawford said, voicing what everyone had been thinking. "Soon as we start using it regular, they'll have mortars walking all over that cliff face." Doss nodded, but his expression remained calm, almost serene in a way that Crawford found both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Faith was a private matter for most soldiers, but Doss wore his beliefs openly, praying over his meals and carrying a small Bible in his aid kit alongside the medical supplies. Some men found comfort in his presence. Others worried that his convictions might compromise tactical decisions when those decisions meant the difference between life and death. The rope stretched across 40 feet of empty air, anchored to hope and necessity rather than anything resembling tactical doctrine. Tomorrow morning felt like a promise no one was certain they could keep, and the ridge waited with the patient indifference of ground that had already claimed too many lives. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first wounded man reached the cliff edge just as the rain intensified, turning the coral dust into slippery paste that made every step treacherous. Private Kowalski had taken shrapnel in both legs during a mortar barrage that caught his squad crossing open ground, and now he lay on a makeshift stretcher fashioned from rifle stocks and a shelter half, conscious but pale with shock. Doss knelt beside him, checking the tourniquets that were keeping him alive while Crawford and Williams prepared the rope system they'd only tested with sandbags. "We're going to get you down to the aid station," Doss said, his voice steady despite the machine gun fire that periodically raked the ridge's eastern approaches. "Doc Peterson's got everything ready down there." Kowalski gripped Doss's wrist with surprising strength. "That rope going to hold me?" "It's held everything we've put on it so far," Crawford interjected, though his own confidence wavered as he watched the hemp fibers darken with moisture. The anchor point looked solid, but 40 feet was a long way to fall, and the coral formations below left no room for error. Lieutenant Morrison crawled over from the command post, keeping low as sporadic rifle fire snapped overhead. Intelligence reports from the 77th Infantry Division suggested that Japanese resistance across Okinawa was stiffening, with enemy commanders apparently willing to trade territory for American casualties in a war of attrition that favored whoever could endure the longest. The ridge represented just one piece of a larger puzzle, but from up here it felt like the entire war had condensed down to a few hundred yards of contested ground. "Hospital corpsmen are standing by below," Morrison reported. "But we need to move fast. Observers report enemy movement in the caves, and they're probably adjusting mortar fires right now." Doss checked Kowalski's wounds one final time, ensuring that the field dressings would hold during the descent. His medical training had prepared him for battlefield conditions, but nothing in the manual addressed lowering wounded men down cliff faces while under enemy observation. Every decision carried weight beyond immediate medical concerns, and the rope had become a lifeline in the most literal sense possible. Williams took his position at the anchor point while Crawford managed the lowering system they'd improvised from climbing techniques learned in training and refined under pressure. The rope ran through a simple belay device fashioned from a carabiner and wrapped twice around the tree stump for additional friction. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and elegance had become less important than reliability over the past 3 days. "On belay," Crawford called, using mountaineering terminology that felt strangely formal given their circumstances. "Belay on," Williams responded, taking up the slack in the rope. Doss helped Kowalski into the improvised harness they'd rigged from pistol belts and parachute cord, making sure the wounded soldier was secure without cutting off circulation to his injured legs. The system relied on trust as much as technique, and Doss found himself whispering a brief prayer as he checked the connections one final time. Faith and physics would have to work together if any of them were going to survive the next 24 hours. The descent began slowly, with Kowalski disappearing over the cliff edge in careful stages while Crawford managed the rope from above. The hemp line stretched and creaked under the load, its fibers compressed by moisture and weight in ways that made everyone nervous. From below came the muffled voices of medical personnel positioning themselves to receive the wounded soldier, their presence both reassuring and fragile in the face of everything that could go wrong. Sergeant Phillips watched the operation through binoculars, scanning the opposite ridgeline for muzzle flashes that might indicate enemy observation. The Japanese had been patient so far, content to let the Americans exhaust themselves, holding untenable positions. But that patience wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, someone would decide that the rope represented a target worth engaging, and then the evacuation route would become a liability rather than an asset. Movement in the caves, Phillips reported quietly. Could be repositioning, could be preparing fires. How long to get Kowalski down? Morrison asked. 5 minutes if everything goes smooth, Crawford replied. 10 if we have to stop and deal with problems. The rope continued its steady descent, carrying not just a wounded soldier but the hopes of everyone remaining on the ridge. Medical supplies were running low, ammunition was being rationed, and the weather showed no signs of improving. The 77th Infantry Division's positions across Okinawa were holding, but holding wasn't the same as winning, and everyone understood that their current situation represented a test of endurance rather than tactical brilliance. Doss remained at the cliff edge, watching Kowalski's progress and maintaining communication with the medical team below. His calm presence had become something the men relied on, a fixed point in circumstances that seemed to shift without warning. The rope had given them options, but options required someone willing to use them, and that responsibility had fallen naturally to the medic who refused to carry a weapon but never hesitated to move forward under fire. The rain continued falling, steady and cold, turning the rope dark and making every surface treacherous. Tomorrow morning remained 12 hours away, and 12 hours had become a very long time. By afternoon, they'd lowered 4 men down the rope, and Doss's hands showed rope burns that he ignored with the same methodical determination he applied to everything else. The hemp line had stretched under repeated loading, requiring constant adjustment of the anchor point and belay system that Crawford and Williams managed with growing expertise. Private Martinez, the latest to make the descent, had reached the bottom safely despite a mortar round that detonated close enough to shower the cliff face with coral fragments while he hung suspended halfway down. The Japanese had begun probing the ridge's defenses with increasing boldness, sending small units forward to test American positions and gather intelligence for what everyone assumed would be a larger assault. Lieutenant Morrison spent most of his time coordinating with observation posts, trying to piece together enemy intentions from fragmentary reports and the sound of movement in areas where movement shouldn't exist. "They're mapping our positions," Morrison explained during a brief break in the fighting. "Every time we use the rope, they're watching, timing, figuring out our capabilities." Sergeant Phillips, his wounded arm now functional enough for light duty, pointed toward the eastern approaches where enemy activity had been most concentrated. "Question is whether they're planning to hit us direct or just keep us pinned while they work around our flanks." Doss knelt beside Private Thompson, who'd taken a rifle round through the shoulder during the last exchange of fire. The wound was clean, missing major arteries, but Thompson was showing signs of shock that would require immediate evacuation if he was going to survive the night. The rope had become their lifeline in more ways than one, but each use exposed them to enemy observation and potential interdiction fires. "Can you hold until dark?" Doss asked Thompson quietly. "Might be safer to get you down after they lose visibility on the cliff face." "Whatever you think, Doc," Thompson replied, though his voice carried the tension of a man trying not to think about hanging from a rope while people shot at him. Crawford tested the anchor point again, checking for signs of wear that might indicate imminent failure. The tree stump had held so far, but repeated loading was working the rope deeper into the wood, creating stress concentrations that made everyone nervous. Military engineering had never addressed the problem of evacuating casualties down cliff faces using improvised equipment, and they were making up procedures as circumstances demanded. From the valley below came the distant rumble of artillery, American guns firing in support of other elements of the 77th Infantry Division engaged in their own battles for contested ground. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that they weren't entirely alone on this ridge, but it also emphasized how isolated their position had become. Relief forces were still 12 hours away, and 12 hours represented a very long time when measured in wounded men and dwindling supplies. Williams crawled back from the observation post with news that nobody wanted to hear. "Mortars registering on the trail below," he reported. "They've got observers spotting for them, and they're walking rounds closer to the collection point." The implications were clear to everyone. The Japanese had identified the evacuation route and were preparing to interdict it, turning their lifeline into a target that would claim lives rather than save them. The rope still stretched across the cliff edge, but its utility was rapidly diminishing as enemy fires grew more accurate and sustained. Doss continued treating Thompson's wound, applying pressure dressings and monitoring vital signs with the kind of focused attention that excluded everything beyond immediate medical concerns. His faith had carried him through training and across multiple combat zones, but here on the ridge it had evolved into something more practical, a refusal to accept that any wounded man was beyond saving as long as options remained available. "Doc Peterson's asking about the next casualty," Morrison said, consulting his radio handset. "Medical supplies are running low down there, and they need to know how many more we're planning to send." "As many as it takes," Doss replied without looking up from Thompson's bandages. The rain had stopped, but visibility remained poor due to smoke from burning vegetation and the haze that always seemed to hang over contested ground. Japanese positions were difficult to locate with precision, hidden among coral formations that provided natural concealment and fields of fire that covered every approach to the ridge. The enemy had chosen their ground well, and they were fighting with the patience of people who understood time was on their side. Private Johnson approached with news from the ammunition detail. Rifle rounds were down to 30 per man. Machine gun ammunition was running critically low, and they'd already expended most of their grenades during yesterday's fighting. The mathematics of combat were working against them, and everyone understood that their tactical situation would only deteriorate as the day wore on. The rope waited at the cliff edge, frayed but functional, representing both hope and vulnerability in equal measure. Thompson would need to go down before dark, and after Thompson, there would probably be others. The Japanese were preparing something, and when it came, the medic who refused to carry a weapon would face his greatest test yet. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The assault began at sunset, with a precision that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of American positions. Japanese infantry moved forward in small groups, using coral formations for cover, while mortars bracketed the ridge's defended areas with increasing accuracy. Lieutenant Morrison's radio crackled with situation reports from observation posts, but the static-filled transmissions painted a picture of coordinated pressure from multiple directions rather than any single decisive thrust. Doss was halfway through lowering Thompson when the first mortar rounds landed near the cliff face. The wounded soldier hung suspended 30 feet above the collection point when coral fragments showered down around him, and Crawford felt the rope jerk in his hands as Thompson instinctively tried to shield himself from the debris. The anchor point held, but stress was concentrating in places where the hemp fibers were already showing signs of wear. "Keep him moving," Morrison called from the command post. "We can't leave him hanging out there." Williams managed the belay while Crawford worked to maintain smooth descent, despite the incoming fire that was growing more accurate with each adjustment. The Japanese had clearly identified the evacuation route as a priority target, and their observers were calling in corrections that brought explosive rounds closer to the rope's path with mathematical precision. Thompson reached the bottom just as a mortar detonated close enough to spray everyone with coral dust and the smell of cordite. "Next casualty ready?" Doss called, already knowing the answer. Private Daniels had taken shrapnel in both legs and his lower back, wounds that would prove fatal without immediate surgery that could only be performed at the aid station below. The rope was their only option, but using it now meant exposing both patient and rescuer to fires that were becoming concentrated and sustained rather than sporadic and exploratory. Sergeant Phillips low-crawled to the cliff edge, assessing the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that came from too many battles fought on similar ground. "They've got us bracketed," he reported. "Soon as we put someone on that rope, they're gonna drop everything they've got on the cliff face." "Then we do it fast," Doss replied, checking Daniel's harness connections with hands that no longer trembled despite the chaos erupting around them. The decision to continue evacuations represented more than medical necessity. It had become a question of whether they would allow enemy fire to dictate their actions or maintain their own operational tempo despite the risks. Morrison understood the tactical implications, but he also understood that leaving wounded men on the ridge overnight would mean losing them to shock, blood loss, and exposure in conditions where every life represented irreplaceable human value. Crawford took his position at the anchor point. While Williams prepared the belay system they'd now used successfully 6 times under increasingly difficult circumstances. The rope showed significant wear at stress points, particularly where it wrapped around the tree stump, but the fibers remained intact and capable of supporting human weight for what everyone hoped would be one more descent. "On belay," Crawford called. "Belay on," Williams replied. Doss helped Daniels over the cliff edge just as Japanese infantry launched their main assault against the ridge's eastern defenses. Rifle fire intensified to a sustained roar, punctuated by grenade explosions and the distinctive chatter of machine guns firing in short, disciplined bursts. The attack was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, designed to overwhelm American positions through coordinated pressure rather than brute force. The rope stretched taut under Daniel's weight, while mortar rounds walked closer to the cliff face with methodical precision. Crawford could hear the whistle of incoming rounds growing louder with each adjustment, and he knew they had minutes at most before the evacuation route became completely untenable. Japanese observers were calling in corrections with the kind of accuracy that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain and plenty of time to register their fires. Halfway down, Daniels stopped moving. The rope remained taut, but the wounded soldier hung motionless in his harness, either unconscious from blood loss or paralyzed by the explosions that were now bracketing the cliff face with increasing frequency. Doss could see him from the edge, suspended between safety and disaster, 30 feet from medical care that might arrive too late to matter. "He's not responding," Williams called over the sound of incoming fire. Without hesitation, Doss secured his own improvised harness and started down the rope after Daniels. The decision violated every principle of tactical medicine. Medics weren't supposed to expose themselves unnecessarily, and hanging from a rope under enemy fire represented the kind of exposure that training manuals specifically prohibited. but training manuals hadn't addressed the reality of men dying alone in space while help waited just out of reach. Crawford watched both men descend, while mortar rounds crept closer to their position with mechanical inevitability. The rope burned through his gloves as he managed two bodies instead of one, fighting to maintain controlled descent, while explosions showered them with fragments that rang against helmets and equipment. The anchor point groaned under the doubled load, hemp fibers stretching beyond their design limits. Japanese infantry had reached the ridge's perimeter, and small arms fire now cracked overhead with the flat authority of rounds passing close to their targets. Morrison's radio transmitted fragmented reports of hand-to-hand fighting in forward positions, but Crawford's entire world had condensed down to 40 feet of hemp rope and two men whose lives depended on his ability to lower them through a killing zone. The rope held. Both men reached the collection point as mortar fire shifted to other targets, and medical personnel immediately began working on Daniels, while Doss climbed back up through the darkness with movements that seemed powered by something beyond physical endurance. When he reached the top, 7 more wounded men were waiting, what the citation would later describe as extraordinary heroism felt from inside Doss's exhausted mind, more like a mathematical problem that couldn't be solved. 7 wounded men lay in varying states of consciousness around the cliff edge, while Japanese infantry consolidated positions less than 50 yards away and artillery continued falling with the kind of systematic coverage that left no safe spaces on the ridge. The rope had held through 9 descents, but the hemp fibers were separating at stress points, and the anchor around the tree stump had worked loose enough to require constant retightening. The first secret that Doss would never share was how close he came to stopping. Private Williams had been hit during the last enemy assault, taking rifle rounds in the chest and abdomen that left him conscious but bleeding internally at a rate that would kill him within minutes rather than hours. The rope could save him, but using it meant exposing Crawford to enemy fire while the anchor point was compromised and the evacuation route was under direct observation. "Doc," Williams whispered, gripping Doss's sleeve with hands already growing cold, "don't let me die up here." The tactical decision was clear. Conserve resources, minimize exposure, wait for conditions to improve before attempting further evacuations. 7 wounded men represented more than the rope could safely handle in its current condition, and Crawford was showing signs of exhaustion that would compromise his ability to manage the anchor point safely. Lieutenant Morrison had already suggested waiting until morning, when relief forces might provide better security for evacuation operations. But Doss knelt beside Williams and whispered a prayer that wasn't in any military manual, a conversation with God that had become as automatic as checking pulse and respiration. His faith had carried him through training across the Pacific and up this ridge, but here it evolved into something harder to define, a refusal to accept that practical limitations should determine who lived and who died when other options remained possible. "We're going down," he told Williams quietly. "All of us." The second secret was how the rope actually looked as they rigged Williams for descent. Several strands had parted under repeated loading, and the remaining fibers were stretched beyond safe working limits by any reasonable standard. Crawford tested the anchor point and found movement that hadn't been there an hour earlier, the tree stump showing stress fractures where the rope had worn grooves in the wood. "This thing's gonna fail," Crawford said, stating the obvious with the kind of honesty that combat demanded. "Maybe not this time, maybe not next time, but soon." "Then we do it fast," Doss replied, using words that had become his standard response to tactical problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Williams went down first, lowered through space while mortar rounds fell close enough to shower the cliff face with debris. The rope held, but Crawford could feel individual fibers snapping under the load, stress concentrating in areas where the hemp was already compromised by moisture and repeated flexing. When Williams reached the bottom safely, 6 men remained, and the anchor point had loosened enough to require complete re-rigging around what remained of the tree stump. Private Kowalski, evacuated earlier in the day, would later tell investigators that he'd counted 37 separate trips down the rope before dawn, though official records would list only the documented medical evacuations rather than the total number of descents. The difference represented wounded Japanese soldiers whom Doss had also lowered to medical care, enemy infantry found unconscious or dying among the coral formations, who received the same treatment as American casualties. That was the third secret, the one that would complicate the narrative of heroism in ways that made official accounts uncomfortable. Doss treated wounds without regard to the uniform worn by their owner, applying tourniquets and pressure dressings to Japanese soldiers with the same methodical care he gave to men from his own unit. When those enemy wounded could be safely evacuated, he lowered them down the rope to medical personnel who were trained to provide care regardless of nationality or political affiliation. "You're treating Japs?" Crawford asked during a brief lull in the fighting. "I'm treating wounded," Doss replied, checking the harness around an unconscious Japanese soldier who'd been found bleeding among the American casualties. "Same as always." The rope continued its work through the night, carrying American and Japanese wounded down through space while artillery fell around the cliff face with mechanical persistence. Each descent represented a small victory against the mathematics of combat, but the victories were accumulating faster than anyone could count, and the rope was deteriorating at a rate that made every trip potentially the last. By 0300 hours, 31 men had reached safety through 40 feet of empty air, supported by hemp fibers that were held together more by prayer than physics. Crawford's hands were bleeding from rope burns, Williams was fighting shock at the aid station below, and Doss was moving with the kind of automated determination that suggested he'd passed beyond normal human limitations into something harder to categorize. The final secret was what he whispered to each man before lowering him over the edge. "Lord, please help me get just one more." Not a prayer for courage or protection, but a specific request for strength enough to complete one additional task. By dawn, he'd made that request 75 times, and 75 times the rope had held long enough to matter. When relief forces finally reached the ridge at sunrise, they found Doss unconscious beside the frayed remains of a rope that should have failed hours earlier. The mathematical impossibility of what had happened would be compressed into official language that emphasized heroism while omitting the human cost of carrying that kind of responsibility. The rope itself was quietly discarded, its service too extraordinary to be preserved through normal channels. 20 years later, Doss would wake in his small Virginia farmhouse to the sound of rain on the roof and immediately smell hemp rope, wet coral, and the metallic scent of blood that had never quite left his memory. The nightmares had diminished over time, but they never completely disappeared, and certain sounds could transport him back to that ridge with the kind of vividness that made the intervening decades feel like a brief interruption rather than a separate life entirely. The official account, when it was finally written, compressed 12 hours of individual decisions into 3 paragraphs that emphasized miraculous courage while omitting the trembling hands, whispered prayers, and moments of near collapse that had actually characterized his actions. The Congressional Medal of Honor citation mentioned 75 lives saved, but didn't specify that some of those lives had belonged to enemy soldiers, or that the rope had been held together by frayed strands and desperate necessity for the final 6 hours of its use. Dr. Peterson, who had received the wounded at the aid station below, would spend his later career trying to understand the medical implications of what he'd witnessed. 31 American casualties evacuated under impossible conditions, plus an unknown number of Japanese wounded who'd been treated with the same methodical care despite the tactical situation. The mathematics didn't work according to any standard protocol, but the evidence was overwhelming. Men who should have died on the ridge had instead received definitive medical care within the golden hour that determined survival rates. "I keep thinking about that rope," Peterson told a military historian decades later. "By all rights, it should have failed after the first dozen trips. Hemp fiber has known breaking strength, and we exceeded that by any reasonable calculation. But it held, and I've never been able to explain why." Crawford returned to civilian life as a construction foreman, building bridges and high-rise buildings where rope work was measured in safety factors and engineering specifications rather than prayers and desperation. He never spoke publicly about his role in the evacuations, but his personnel file contained a notation that he demonstrated exceptional technical skill under adverse conditions that had directly contributed to saving lives during combat operations. The tree stump that had served as their anchor point was removed during post-war construction, but Crawford had quietly saved a section of the wood that showed rope grooves worn deep enough to indicate the stress loads they'd somehow managed. The piece sat on his workshop bench for 40 years, a reminder of mathematics that shouldn't have worked, but did. Private Williams survived his wounds and became a teacher in Ohio, where he occasionally mentioned his military service to students studying World War II history. His account always focused on the technical aspects of the evacuation system rather than individual heroism, describing the improvised equipment and procedures that had turned a cliff face into a functional casualty evacuation route. He never mentioned that he'd been the first to suggest giving up when the rope began showing signs of failure. Lieutenant Morrison's after-action report, filed 3 days after the engagement, noted that extraordinary measures were employed to maintain unit effectiveness despite adverse tactical conditions. The clinical language couldn't capture the reality of watching one unarmed medic refuse to abandon wounded men despite enemy fire, equipment failure, and tactical doctrine that recommended withdrawal to more defensible positions. What the report also couldn't capture was Morrison's recommendation that Doss be immediately transferred to rear area duty, not as punishment, but as recognition that his value to the war effort had become too great to risk in frontline combat. The recommendation was quietly rejected by higher command, who understood that removing Doss from his unit would damage morale in ways that might prove irreparable. The rope itself disappeared into military salvage operations, its service record unknown to the personnel who processed it as routine combat waste. No one thought to preserve the hemp fibers that had somehow held together long enough to save 75 lives, and the physical evidence of what had happened was lost to the practical requirements of military logistics. But Doss carried the weight of that rope in his hands for the rest of his life. The burn scars faded, but his fingers retained muscle memory of hemp fiber under stress, the particular feel of a loaded line that might fail without warning. He could still recall the exact amount of tension that indicated safe working loads, and the subtle changes in rope behavior that preceded catastrophic failure. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes find himself testing knots that he hadn't tied in decades, checking anchor points that existed only in memory. The motions were automatic, unconscious, a physical prayer that connected him to men who had reached safety because one piece of military equipment had performed beyond its design specifications when extraordinary performance was the only thing standing between life and death. The citation spoke of miraculous courage, but what Doss remembered most clearly was the mathematical certainty that the rope would eventually fail, and the equally certain knowledge that men would die if he stopped using it before that failure occurred. Faith and physics had somehow worked together for 12 hours, and the intersection of those forces had created a space where 75 men found their way home from a ridge that should have been the end of their stories. The rope was gone, but its weight remained, carried in the hands of a man who had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary human actions begin with the simplest prayer: "Lord, please help me get just one more." If this story reminded you that behind every medal, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.